There are cases where the truth announces itself loudly, through chaos, witnesses, or obvious motive. And then there are cases like this one, where the most important clues were never meant to be seen at all. When high school senior Amani Rhodes was found dead, investigators initially searched for the usual answers: where she had been, who she had last spoken to, what might have gone wrong. But what ultimately reframed the entire case wasn't found at the scene. It was found in silence. As detectives began combing through digital devices tied to people in Amani's orbit, they uncovered something that felt less like evidence and more like a private archive of obsession. Thousands of text messages, never sent, never received, drafted to Amani by a classmate she had rejected. Messages written and rewritten, stretching back weeks, then months. Each one assumed familiarity. Each one assumed intimacy. Together, they told the story of a relationship that had only ever existed in one mind. What followed was even more unsettling. In the suspect's bedroom, investigators found a wall covered in photographs of Amani. Not casual snapshots or shared memories, but images collected from afar, school events, social media, moments you didn't know were being preserved. Next to each photo were handwritten notes, marking what he believed were her infractions. Smiles directed at other people. Missed glances. Ordinary teenage behavior, reinterpreted as personal offenses that demanded accountability. To investigators, it became clear that this was not simply fixation. It was structure. A system of imagined rules, violations, and consequences. A narrative where rejection was no longer rejection, but betrayal. Where autonomy became provocation. Where a routine high school existence was recast as a series of intentional acts against someone who believed he was owed more. As the investigation deepened, experts would later describe what had been building quietly over time, a fantasy relationship reinforced daily by proximity, routine, and misinterpretation. A belief system that grew unchecked, hidden behind the normalcy of hallways, classrooms, and shared schedules. Nothing about it appeared urgent, until suddenly, it was. This is not just the story of what happened to Amani Rhodes. It's a story of how something dangerous can develop in plain sight, unnoticed, until it demands to be seen. Before her name became associated with an investigation, Amani Rhodes was known for far more ordinary things. She was a high school senior navigating the familiar mix of pressure and anticipation that comes with the final year before adulthood. Her days were shaped by class schedules, extracurricular commitments, friendships built over years, and quiet conversations about what might come next. College applications, future plans, and the slow realization that childhood was ending all existed in the background of her life. To those who knew her, Amani was steady and grounded. She wasn't someone who sought attention, nor someone who faded into the background. She occupied a comfortable middle space, recognized, respected, and connected. Teachers remembered her as reliable. Friends described her as thoughtful and consistent. She showed up when she said she would. She kept her routines. And like many teenagers, she moved through the world assuming that her boundaries would be understood, or at least respected. Amani's life followed predictable patterns. She walked the same hallways each morning, sat in the same classrooms, shared the same lunch periods with classmates she'd known for years. These routines felt unremarkable, even invisible, in the way everyday life often does. But later, investigators would come to understand that these patterns, so normal to Amani, were being carefully observed and reinterpreted by someone else. At home, she was a daughter with plans forming just beyond reach. There were expectations, responsibilities, and conversations about independence. Nothing about her life suggested danger. There were no alarms being raised. No warnings that something had gone wrong. From the outside, Hermione's world looked like the world of countless other teenagers standing at the edge of adulthood. That normalcy matters. Because in cases like this, it's easy for the narrative to become consumed by the crime itself, by the person who committed it, by the shocking details left behind. But understanding what was lost requires slowing down and recognizing who Hermione was before her name was ever spoken by investigators or read in court documents. She was not defined by what happened to her. She was defined by the life she was living. This documentary is part of Beyond the Evidence, a channel focused on examining not just what happened in cases like this, but how and why events unfold the way they do. The goal is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand the mechanisms, social, psychological, and systemic, that allow these stories to exist at all. If viewers find value in that approach, subscribing helps support continued, careful reporting. As Hermione moved through her final year of high school, she interacted with dozens of people every day. Most of those interactions were fleeting. Some were friendly. A few were awkward in the way teenage interactions often are. None of them, from her perspective, carried hidden meaning or long-term consequence. She had no reason to believe that simply existing in shared spaces could be interpreted as something else entirely. But while Hermione experienced her life as straightforward and self-directed, someone nearby was constructing a parallel narrative, one built from observation rather than participation. And that disconnect between who Hermione believed she was to others and who she was imagined to be by one person in particular would become central to everything that followed. In any high school, proximity often creates the illusion of closeness. Students pass each other daily, share classrooms, sit a few seats apart, and absorb the same announcements and routines. For most, these interactions remain surface level, acknowledged, then forgotten. But in this case, investigators would later determine that proximity played a far more significant role, quietly shaping a narrative that only one person believed was real. The classmate who would later become the focus of the investigation was not someone who stood out in obvious ways. He wasn't known for disruptive behavior, nor was he considered socially dominant or openly withdrawn. To teachers and peers, he appeared unremarkable, another student moving through the same institutional rhythms as everyone else. There were no formal complaints, no disciplinary record that suggested volatility. On the surface, there was nothing to separate him from hundreds of other students sharing the same space. Hermione, for her part, understood him only in that limited context. He was a classmate, someone she recognized, perhaps exchanged brief words with, and then moved past. There was no close friendship, no romantic involvement, no private bond. Their interactions, as far as her experience went, ended where the school day ended. They did not extend into her personal life or her sense of emotional obligation. But evidence gathered later revealed that this shared environment was being interpreted very differently by him. Routine encounters, passing in hallways, sitting in nearby desks, seeing Hermione laugh with friends, were absorbed and assigned meaning. Familiarity was mistaken for intimacy. Visibility was confused with access. Over time, these observations were woven together into a personal narrative that did not require her participation to feel real to him. Investigators would later note how this dynamic developed quietly. There was no dramatic pursuit, no public declarations, no moments that would have drawn attention from others. Instead, the fixation unfolded internally, reinforced by repetition and proximity. Each day provided new material. A glance misread, a schedule overlap interpreted as intention, a normal social interaction reframed as personal significance. This imbalance between what a Manny believed existed and what he believed existed became the defining feature of their connection. One reality was grounded in shared space and casual recognition. The other was built on interpretation, assumption, and entitlement. And because it required no response or confirmation from a Manny, it was able to grow unchecked. What made this dynamic particularly difficult to detect was its ordinariness from the outside. Nothing about their interactions appeared unusual. There were no visible confrontations, no escalating public behavior, no moments that demanded intervention. To classmates and faculty, they were simply two students moving through the same hallways, living separate lives that happened to overlap. But as investigators would later understand, those overlapping moments were being collected, catalogued, and emotionally invested with meaning far beyond their reality. And while Amani continued to experience a world as autonomous and unthreatening, someone nearby was building a version of her that existed solely to serve his internal narrative. That disconnect between shared space and imagined relationship set the foundation for what would come next. Because once a fantasy becomes established as truth, any challenge to it can feel like an attack. And in this case, the challenge was coming. The moment that would later be identified as the turning point was, at the time, unremarkable. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic exchange that would have lingered in memory. Amani made her position clear in a way that was direct and appropriate, communicating that she was not interested in anything beyond a casual, classmate-level interaction. From her perspective, it was a boundary, one she had every right to set, and one she assumed would be accepted. For most people, rejection carries disappointment, perhaps embarrassment, and then fades. But investigators would later determine that for him, this moment did not register as a simple no. Instead, it collided head-on with the internal narrative he had been building for months. A narrative where shared space meant shared meaning, and familiarity had already been misclassified as mutual interest. When that narrative was challenged, it did not dissolve. It reconfigured itself. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to take shape, changes that, at the time, went unnoticed. He became more internally preoccupied, more focused on tracking Amani's movements and interactions, even as outward behavior remained largely unchanged. The rejection was not processed as closure, but as contradiction. And rather than questioning his assumptions, he began to reinterpret her actions to preserve the fantasy. This reinterpretation marked the beginning of what experts later described as emotional bookkeeping. Ordinary behaviors were mentally logged and assigned value. Amani speaking to other classmates became a slight. A lack of acknowledgement became intentional disregard. Her continued autonomy was reframed as provocation. Each perceived offense was quietly recorded, reinforcing the belief that she was aware of his feelings and choosing to ignore them. There were early warning signs embedded in this shift, though they were invisible without hindsight. Fixation replaced interest. Entitlement replaced hope. He began drafting messages he never sent, long, detailed texts that imagined conversations, explanations, and justifications. These drafts allowed him to maintain a sense of connection without risking further rejection. They also insulated his beliefs from reality, eliminating the possibility of contradiction. Importantly, none of this escalation required Amani's involvement. She continued with her routines, unaware that her boundaries had been reinterpreted as betrayals. To her, nothing had changed. To him, everything had. The rejection had not ended the imagined relationship. It had transformed it into something adversarial. Investigators would later emphasize how common this stage is in cases of fixation. It rarely announces itself with overt aggression. Instead, it often hides behind quiet persistence and internal grievance. Because the behavior remains largely contained, there is little opportunity for intervention. No one hears the arguments playing out in someone else's mind. By the time the rejection had fully rewritten itself into a personal injustice, the narrative was no longer about connection. It was about correction. And with that shift, the emotional stakes changed dramatically, setting the stage for a dangerous escalation that no one around them could yet see. As weeks passed, the internal narrative did not cool or soften. Instead, it became more rigid. What had once been imagined closeness hardened into expectation, and expectation slowly transformed into perceived obligation. Investigators would later determine that this phase marked a critical shift, the point where fantasy stopped being comforting and began demanding resolution. The unsent messages continued to accumulate. Each draft built upon the last, reinforcing a version of events where Amani was no longer an independent person, but an active participant in a story she had never agreed to join. In these drafts, rejection was reframed repeatedly, not as a boundary, but as a test, a misunderstanding, or a deliberate act meant to provoke response. The lack of reply was no longer neutral. It became evidence. At the same time, the system of imagined infractions grew more elaborate. Investigators would later find that behaviors as ordinary as walking with friends, laughing in group settings, or failing to acknowledge his presence were categorized as violations. These were not fleeting thoughts. They were documented, revisited, and assigned emotional weight. Over time, the accumulation of perceived wrongs created a sense of grievance that felt, to him, justified. Experts later testified that this stage is often where fixation becomes dangerous. The individual is no longer seeking connection or validation. Instead, they are seeking restoration of a perceived imbalance. The internal logic shifts from why doesn't she feel the same way to why is she allowed to do this? That reframing strips the other person of autonomy and recasts them as a problem to be addressed. Outwardly, nothing appeared urgent. He continued attending school, continued blending into routine. There were no public confrontations, no visible outbursts that might have prompted concern. The escalation was entirely internal, driven by interpretation rather than interaction. And because it relied on private evidence, drafts, thoughts, imagined slights, it remained hidden. The crime itself occurred when that internal pressure reached a point where the fantasy could no longer sustain itself without real-world action. Investigators later reconstructed the sequence carefully, focusing on movements, timing, and intent rather than graphic detail. What mattered most was not how the act was carried out, but why it occurred at that moment. According to forensic analysis, the act was not impulsive in the way sudden rage is often portrayed. It was the result of prolonged rumination, a culmination of months spent reinforcing a belief system that framed violence as correction rather than harm. In his internal narrative, the act was not seen as an ending, but as a response, an attempt to resolve what he believed had been taken from him. Amani did not see this coming. There was no evidence that she felt threatened or believed she was in danger. She had continued living her life as she always had, unaware that her normal routines had been recast as provocations. That lack of awareness is one of the most difficult aspects of the case to confront. The danger existed entirely outside her field of perception. When her life was taken, the imagined relationship ended not with understanding or closure, but with irreversible loss. The fantasy that had once provided structure collapsed instantly under the weight of reality. What remained was not justification, but devastation, felt most deeply by those who knew Amani as she truly was, not as she had been imagined. Investigators would later emphasize that the most unsettling aspect of this phase was its quietness. There was no dramatic escalation visible to others. No obvious moment where intervention felt necessary. The transformation from fixation to violence happened without spectacle, fueled by a private logic that resisted correction. In the aftermath, one truth became unavoidable. The collision between fantasy and reality did not resolve the obsession. It exposed it. And by the time it did, the cost was immeasurable. In the hours after Amani Rhodes was found dead, there was no clear explanation, only absence. Classmates arrived at school expecting another ordinary day, and were instead met with confusion, rumors, and a growing sense that something was deeply wrong. Administrators struggled to communicate what little was known, while attempting to contain a shock that moved faster than facts. For those closest to Amani, the loss was incomprehensible. Friends searched their recent conversations for signs they might have missed. Teachers replayed ordinary interactions, wondering if there had been anything they should have noticed. Her family was thrust into a reality defined by sudden silence, where routines were replaced by unanswered questions and a grief that had no shape yet. The wider community reacted much the same way. Vigils were organized. Social media filled with photographs of Amani smiling at school events, surrounded by friends who were now trying to reconcile those images with the knowledge that she was gone. The collective response was one of disbelief, not only at the loss itself, but at the lack of an immediate narrative that could explain it. At this stage, there was no public understanding of motive. There was no clear suspect. The details that would later define the case had not yet surfaced. What people knew was limited to the fact that a young life had ended violently, and that no one seemed to understand why. That uncertainty intensified the grief, leaving space for fear and speculation to take hold. School officials focused on stability, bringing in counselors and encouraging students to talk. But even those conversations circled the same unanswered question. How could something like this happen here? In a place defined by routine and familiarity? The lack of answers made the environment feel suddenly fragile, as though the normal rules no longer applied. Amani's family faced a different reality, one marked by permanence. The immediate aftermath for them was not about public reaction or media attention, but about private moments of loss. Her room, her belongings, plans that would never be realized. While the community searched for meaning, they were confronted with the finality of absence. Law enforcement, meanwhile, worked quietly in the background. While the public mourned, investigators began assembling timelines, reviewing digital footprints, and retracing Amani's final movements. They did not yet share what they were finding. The distance between what the public knew and what investigators were uncovering began to widen. This period, defined by shock without answers, would not last long. But it left a lasting imprint. It was a moment suspended between loss and understanding, where grief existed without explanation. And as investigators moved closer to the truth, it became clear that the answers, when they came, would be far more disturbing than anyone anticipated. As the investigation moved forward, detectives began doing what they do in every case involving a young victim, reconstructing her world piece by piece. Phone records were reviewed. Social media accounts were examined. Messages were mapped against timelines. At first, nothing stood out as overtly threatening. There were no arguments, no alarming exchanges, no signs that Amani believed she was in danger. But absence, investigators would soon realize, was part of the pattern. The shift came when attention turned to a classmate whose proximity to Amani placed him repeatedly within her daily orbit. On the surface, there was still little to explain what had happened. There were no sent messages indicating conflict or obsession. No confrontations documented. But when investigators accessed his devices, they encountered something they had not anticipated. What they found were thousands of text messages drafted to Amani but never sent. Messages written late at night. Messages rewritten dozens of times. Some were casual. Others were emotional. Many assumed a closeness that did not exist. Together, they formed a one-sided conversation that spanned weeks and then months, an evolving narrative that continued regardless of her silence. These drafts revealed how rejection had been cognitively transformed. In the absence of response, he filled the void himself, assigning intention and meaning to every imagined exchange. The messages grew longer, more detailed, and more insistent. They did not reflect uncertainty. They reflected certainty, certainty that a connection existed, and that it had been disrupted unfairly. But the most disturbing discovery came during a search of his bedroom. Investigators found a wall covered in photographs of Amani. Some were taken from social media. Others appeared to be candid images captured from shared spaces. Each photo was marked with handwritten notes, cataloging what he believed were her failures, infractions, evidence, in his mind, of disrespect or betrayal. This was not decoration. It was documentation. Forensic specialists later described the wall as a visual reinforcement system. Each image anchored the fantasy to something tangible. Each note transformed ordinary behavior into deliberate offense. Together, they created a framework where emotional grievance could be revisited, justified, and escalated without external input. During interrogation, detectives noted that he did not speak about Amani as someone separate from his internal experience. He spoke as though she had participated in a shared history, one defined by expectation and disappointment. Her rejection was described not as a boundary, but as a violation. The language reflected entitlement rather than loss. A forensic psychiatrist later testified that this pattern was consistent with a fixation in which rejection is misinterpreted as betrayal. In that framework, the individual does not process disappointment as personal. Instead, it is externalized and moralized. The other person becomes responsible for the emotional pain, and punishment begins to feel justified. Critically, experts emphasize that this belief system does not require delusion in the clinical sense. It does not involve hallucinations or break from reality, as it is commonly understood. Rather, it involves rigid misinterpretation, an inability to revise assumptions when faced with contradiction. The fantasy survives because it excludes any evidence that might dismantle it. As these revelations came into focus, the case changed. It was no longer simply about identifying who committed the crime. It became a study in how an internal narrative, left unchallenged, can become self-reinforcing and dangerous. The evidence did not point to a momentary lapse or sudden rage. It pointed to a slow construction of meaning that ultimately justified violence. For investigators, this understanding brought clarity, but not comfort. The pieces fit together, but the picture they formed was deeply unsettling. Amani had not been targeted because of something she did, but because of what she represented within someone else's internal world. And as the findings became public, the focus of the case expanded beyond the crime itself, forcing a broader reckoning with questions that had no easy answers. Once the investigation concluded and charges were filed, the focus of the case shifted from discovery to accountability. The legal process moved forward deliberately, grounded in evidence that was both extensive and deeply disturbing. For prosecutors, the challenge was not establishing responsibility, but presenting a narrative that accurately reflected how the crime unfolded without overstating intent or simplifying motivation. In court, the evidence told a quiet but devastating story. The drafted messages, the photographs, the documented infractions were presented not as spectacle, but as proof of a sustained pattern of fixation. Expert testimony contextualized these behaviors, explaining how they developed over time and how rejection had been cognitively reframed. The goal was clarity, not justification. The forensic psychiatrist's testimony became central to the proceedings. Rather than excusing the violence, it outlined the psychological framework that allowed it to occur. The court heard how the perpetrator mistook autonomy for betrayal, and how that misinterpretation fueled a sense of moral grievance. Responsibility remained clear. Understanding did not diminish accountability. For Amani's family, the legal process offered structure, but not relief. Courtrooms are not places of closure, they are places of confirmation. Each piece of evidence reinforced what had already been lost. While the outcome provided a measure of resolution in the eyes of the law, it could not restore what had been taken or soften the permanence of absence. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. It affirmed responsibility and imposed consequences consistent with the severity of the crime. There was no celebration in the room, no sense of victory. Only the acknowledgement that a line had been drawn between understanding behavior and excusing it, between explanation and accountability. Beyond the courtroom, the case left a lasting impact on the community. Conversations shifted. Parents questioned what signs they might overlook. Schools revisited policies around student behavior, digital monitoring, and mental health resources. The idea that fixation could grow unnoticed within familiar spaces became a source of unease. Yet even in these discussions, experts cautioned against oversimplification. Not every rejection leads to violence. Not every fixation becomes dangerous. The challenge lies in recognizing patterns early without pathologizing normal adolescent emotion. The case underscored how difficult that balance can be. In the end, the consequences extended far beyond sentencing. They lived on in altered perceptions, in heightened awareness, and in a collective understanding that accountability does not undo harm, it only acknowledges it. Amani's life was not defined by the crime, but the response to it would shape how her community moved forward.